82. The Armed Stalemate. The First World War lasted over 4 years, from 1914 to the end of 1918, the United States entering with effective result in the last year. Germany and its allies were called the Central Powers, while the Entente 1257 governments were termed the Allies. The war was appalling in its human costs. On the Western Front, more soldiers were used and killed in the First World War than in the Second. At first, a short war, as in 1870, was universally expected. The German General Staff had its plans ready for a two-front struggle against France and Russia. The disadvantage of fighting on two fronts was offset by the possession of good rail lines, which allowed the rapid shuttling of troops from one front to the other. The German war plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, rested upon this fact. The idea was first to defeat France by the rapid wheeling motion of a tremendous army through Belgium, and then to turn at more leisure against Russia, whose great size and less developed railways would make its deployment much slower. The Schlieffen Plan 7113-1258, the First World War. Land fighting in the First World War was mainly confined to the areas shown by the darker horizontal shading. The huge battles on the Western Front, which produced more casualties than all of the battles in the West during the Second World War, swayed back and forth over an area less than 100 miles wide. The War on Land, 1914 to 1916. On August 3rd, 1914, the Germans launched 78 infantry divisions in a massive invasion toward the west. They were opposed by 72 French divisions, 5 British, and 6 Belgian. The Germans swept irresistibly forward. The Schlieffen Plan seemed to be moving like clockwork. Germany's civilian authorities made plans for the conquest and annexation of 714 11259 large parts of Europe. Then a hitch occurred. The Russians were fulfilling the terms of their alliance. The 10 billion francs invested by the French in Russia now paid their most significant dividend. The Russians pushed 2 armies into Germany, penetrating into East Prussia. The German commander Helmuth von Moltke withdrew forces from the German right wing in France on August 26th for service in the East. The Germans moved on, but their striking arm was weakened, and their lines of communication were already overextended. General Joffre, the French commander, regrouping his forces with strong support from the relatively small British contingent, and at exactly the right moment, ordered a counterattack. The Battle of the Marne. Almost everyone in 1914 expected a short war and a quick resolution of the international crisis. These German soldiers at the Berlin railway station were preparing to board trains that would take them to the front. Accompanied by their wives or girlfriends and carrying flowers, they departed Berlin in early 1915 amid the patriotic fanfare that shaped public opinion during the first years of the war. AKG Images Alamy stock photo. In 12/6, the ensuing Battle of the Marne, fought from September 5th to 12th, changed the whole character of the war. The German invasion was stopped, and the German army was forced to retreat. The plan for defeating France with a single blow had failed. Each side now tried to outflank and destroy the other until the battle lines extended to the sea. The Germans failed to win control of the Channel ports. 715 French and British communications remained uninterrupted. For these reverses, the great victories meanwhile won by the Germans on the Eastern Front, though of gigantic proportions. The battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, at which 225,000 Russians were captured, were in the long run small consolation. The German and Allied armies settled into trenches across the entire Western Front after 1914. Despite repeated, deadly attempts to achieve offensive breakthroughs, neither side could gain strategic advantages or significantly change the long entrenched positions. These vulnerable French soldiers were stationed in a departure trench, preparing for one of the many futile assaults during the protracted military stalemate. Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, LCUSZ 629350. In the West, the war of movement now settled into a war of position. The armies on the Western Front became almost immobile. The famous and once important horse cavalry units disappeared from the battlefield. Because aviation was barely beginning, and motor transport was still new, the armies had trucks, but no self-propelled guns, and no tanks until very late in the war, the basic soldier more than ever was the man on foot. The most deadly new weapon was the machine gun, which made it 1261 impossible for foot soldiers to advance across open fields without overwhelming artillery preparation. The result was a long military stalemate in which the indispensable infantry sought protection in a vast network of trenches. War in the trenches. In 1915, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians put their main effort into an attempt to knock out Russia. They pressed far into the Tsarist Empire. The Russian losses were enormous: 2 million killed, wounded, or captured in 1915 alone. But at the end of the year, the Russian army was still fighting. Meanwhile, the British and French, hoping to open up communications with Russia, launched a naval attack on Ottoman Turkey, which had joined the war as a German ally. Aiming at Constantinople by way of the Dardanelles, the British and French poured 450,000 men into the narrow peninsula of Gallipoli. Large contingents of the invading Allied army were drawn from colonized populations in Asia and Africa, and from Australia and New Zealand. But the campaign soon stalled in another deadly stalemate. Almost 400,000 Ottoman and Allied soldiers were killed or wounded, including more than 140,000 in the British-French expeditionary forces. After almost a year, the Allies abandoned the enterprise as a costly failure. In 1916, both sides turned again to northern France in an attempt to break the deadlock. The Allies planned a great offensive along the river Somme, while the Germans prepared for a new assault near the town of Verdun. The Germans attacked Verdun in February. The French commander Joffre put in General Pétain to defend it, but resisted committing his main reserves, holding them for the coming offensive on the Somme. Pétain and his troops held to minimum numbers, thus had to take the full weight of the German army. The Battle of Verdun lasted almost 10 months, engaged about 2 million soldiers, and 1262 became a legend of determined French resistance. They shall not pass. The Germans finally abandoned the attack because they sustained almost as many casualties as the French, 330,000 to 350,000. The Battle of Verdun. The miseries and dangers on the Western Front are conveyed in this photograph of soldiers in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. Human life in such conditions became a raw struggle for survival. Most soldiers reported that the grinding, daily experience on a battlefield seemed far removed from the nationalism or political concerns of civilians and government leaders. Paul Popper, Popper Photo, Getty Images. While the inferno still raged at Verdun, the Allies opened their offensive on the Somme in July. They brought up vast amounts of artillery, and the newly raised British army was present in force. The idea was to break through the German line simply by stupendous pressure. On both sides, Allied and German, the art of generalship had sunk to an all-time low. Despite a week-long artillery bombardment, the British lost 60,000 men on the first day of the attack. In a week, they had advanced only 1 mile along a 6-mile front. In a month, they had advanced less than 3 miles. The Battle of the Somme, lasting from July to October, cost the 1263 Germans about 500,000 men, the British 400,000, and the French 200,000. Nothing of any value had been gained. It was, indeed, at the Somme that the 717 British first used the tank, an armored vehicle with caterpillar tracks that could crash through barbed wire, lunge over trenches, and smash into machine gun nests. But the tanks were introduced in such small numbers, and with such skepticism on the part of many commanders, that they had no effect on the battle. The Battle of the Somme. The belligerent nations of Europe suffered more casualties in the First World War than in any previous European conflict. The fighting also destroyed millions of horses and large areas of the countryside, as well as whole towns that became part of the battlefield. Examples of such destruction can be seen around these British soldiers who were advancing near the front in Flanders in 1917. Ingram Publishing. The War at Sea 1264, with land armies thus bogged down on all fronts, both sides looked to the sea. The long preponderance of British sea power and the more recent Anglo-German naval race would now be tested. The British, with French aid, imposed a strict naval blockade on all German ports. International law at the time placed goods headed for a country at war into two classes. One class was called contraband. It included munitions and certain specified raw materials that might be used in the manufacture of military equipment. The other class, including foodstuffs and raw cotton, was defined as non-contraband. A country was supposed by international law to be able to import non-contraband goods even in wartime. These terms of wartime 718 law had been set forth as recently as 1909 at an international conference in London. The purpose was to make it impossible for a sea power, that is, the British, to starve out an enemy in wartime or even to interfere with normal civilian production. The jealousy of continental Europe for British sea power was an old story. Naval blockade. Such law, if observed, would make the blockade of Germany entirely ineffective, and the Allies did not observe it. To starve out the enemy and ruin the German economy was precisely their purpose. Economic warfare took its place alongside armed attack as a military weapon, as in the days of Napoleon. The Allies announced a new international law. The distinction between contraband and non-contraband was gradually abolished. The British Navy, aided by the French, proceeded to stop all goods of whatever national origin or character destined for Germany or its allies. The United States protested vehemently against these regulations and defended the trading rights of neutral nations. It reasserted the distinction between contraband and non-contraband, claimed the right to trade with other neutrals, and upheld the freedom of the seas. These claims led to mutual bad feelings between the American and British governments in 1265-1915 and 1916. But when the United States entered the war, it adopted the Allied position, and its Navy joined in enforcing exactly the same regulations. International law was in fact changed. In the Second World War, the very words contraband and freedom of the seas were never heard. The Germans countered with an attempt to blockade England. A few isolated German cruisers were able for some time to destroy British shipping, but the Germans relied mainly on the submarine, against which the British naval power at first seemed helpless. The submarine was an unrefined weapon. A submarine commander could not always tell what kind of ship he was attacking, nor could he remove passengers, confiscate cargo, escort the vessel, or indeed do much except sink it. Citing British abuses of international law in justification, the German government in February 1915 declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone, in which Allied vessels would be torpedoed and neutral vessels would be in grave danger. Submarine warfare. 3 months later, the liner Lusitania was torpedoed off the Irish coast. About 1,200 persons were drowned, including about 120 American citizens. The Lusitania was a British ship. It carried munitions of war manufactured in the United States for Allied use, and the Germans had published ominous warnings in the New York papers that Americans should not take passage on it. Americans then believed that they should be able to sail safely on peaceable errands on the ship of a belligerent power in wartime. The loss of life shocked people in the United States. President Wilson informed the Germans that another such act would be considered deliberately unfriendly. The Germans, to avoid trouble, refrained for 2 years from making full use of their submarines, and the Allied use of the sea during this time was only partly impeded. The Lusitania 1266, the dominance of Allied sea power, was confirmed by the one great naval engagement of the war, the Battle of Jutland. The German admirals became restless at seeing their newly built navy skulking behind minefields on the German shores. Yet they could not presume to challenge the superior British Grand Fleet. They hoped, however, to decoy smaller formations of British ships, destroy them one by one, and perhaps eventually obtain enough of a naval balance to loosen the British-style blockade by which Germany was slowly being strangled. They were themselves, however, trapped into a major engagement in which the British Grand Fleet of 151 ships took them by surprise in the North Sea at the end of May in 1916. After a few hours of furious combat, the Germans were able to 719 withdraw into mined waters. They had lost less tonnage and fewer men than the British. They had proved themselves to be dangerously proficient in naval combat, but they had failed to undermine the British preponderance at sea. diplomatic maneuvers, secret agreements, and imperial competitions. With no military solution in sight, both sides looked for new allies. The Ottoman Empire, fearing Russia, had joined Germany and Austria-Hungary as early as October 1914. The leading prospective ally was Italy, which, though formally a member of the Triple Alliance, had long ago drifted away from it. Both sides solicited the Italian government, which bargained imperturbably with both. The Italian public was divided, but extreme nationalists saw a chance to obtain their irredenta, the border regions in which Italians lived outside the national territory that had been incorporated at the time of national unification. The Italian government therefore cast its lot with the Allies in the Secret Treaty of London of 1915. It was agreed that if the Allies won the war, Italy would receive from Austria the Trentino, the South Tyrol, Istria, and the city of Trieste, and some of the Dalmatian islands. If Britain and France took over Germany's African colonies, Italy should receive additional territory in 1267 Libya and Somaliland. The Treaty of London, in short, continued the most brazen pre-war practices of territorial expansionism, but the Allies were desperate for additional military support. The Italian alliance was thus bought by the Allies, and Italy opened up a new front against Austria-Hungary in May 1915. Italy joins the Allies. The Allies likewise made plans for a final partition of the Ottoman Empire, which still reached from Constantinople through the Middle East into Arabia and into Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. By another secret treaty, they agreed that, upon an Allied victory, Mesopotamia was to go to Britain, Syria and southeastern Asia Minor to France, small portions to Italy, and Kurdistan and Armenia to Russia. The pre-war attitudes and practices of European imperialism thus continued to guide the governments in every warring nation of Europe. Each side also tampered with minorities and discontented groups living within the domains of the other. The Germans promised an independent Poland to embarrass Russia. They stirred up local nationalism in Ukraine. They raised up a pro-German Flemish movement in Belgium. They persuaded the Ottoman Sultan, as caliph, to proclaim a holy war in North Africa, hoping that irate Muslims would drive the British from Egypt and the French from Algeria. This had no success. German agents worked in Ireland, and one Irish nationalist, Sir Roger Casement, landed in Ireland from a German submarine, precipitating the Easter Rebellion of 1916, which was suppressed by the British. To Americans, the most amazing German intervention appeared in the Zimmermann telegram. In 1916, an American military force had crossed the Mexican border in pursuit of a dissident revolutionary group that had raided a town in New Mexico. The Mexican government protested this American border crossing, as relations between the United States and Germany were also deteriorating. In January 1917, the German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Arthur Zimmermann, dispatched a telegram 1268 to the German minister at Mexico City, telling him to inform the Mexican president that if the United States went to war with Germany, the Germans would form an alliance with Mexico, and if possible, Japan, enabling Mexico to get back its lost territories. These territories were in the region that the United States had conquered from Mexico in the 1840s: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. California was not mentioned. Zimmermann's telegram was 720 intercepted and decoded by the British, who sent it to Washington. Printed in the newspapers, it shocked public opinion in the United States. The Zimmermann telegram, Colonel T.E. Lawrence emerged as the key British liaison to Arab forces fighting for independence from the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. He appears in this photograph at Versailles, wearing a British Army uniform and Arab headdress, behind the left shoulder of Prince Faisal, who became the British-appointed King of Iraq in 1921. Historical Corbis Historical, Getty Images. 1269. The Allies were more successful in appealing to nationalist discontent for the obvious reason that the most active national minorities were within the lands of their enemies. They were able to promise restoration of Alsace-Lorraine to France without difficulty. They promised independence to the Poles, though anticipating some difficulty as long as the Russian monarchy stood. It was easier for them to favor national independence for Czechs, Slovaks, and South Slavs, because an Allied victory would dissolve the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Allied use of nationalist ambitions also extended from Europe into the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Within the Ottoman Empire, the British aroused Arab hopes for independence. The British Colonel T.E. Lawrence led an insurrection against the Turks in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, a region called the Hejaz that includes the Muslim holy city of Mecca. Encouraged by Lawrence and the British to pursue aspirations for an independent Arab state, the Emir Hussein of Hejaz in 1916 took the title of King of the Arabs and established a kingdom that reached from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, Zionists saw in the impending Ottoman collapse the opportunity to realize their dream for 721, a Jewish state in Palestine. Because Palestine was peopled by Arabs and had been for over 1,000 years, the Zionist program collided with British plans to sponsor Arab nationalism. Nevertheless, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, issued the famous Balfour Declaration in 1917, promising the British government's support for the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, though with protection for the rights of non-Jewish peoples, and also setting the foundations for a clash between Jewish and Arab nationalisms, which has afflicted the Middle East down to the present. Disruption in the Ottoman Empire, 1270. For the Armenians, these years were especially disastrous. They were a Christian people living in the eastern part of the Anatolian Peninsula, where it abuts on Russia. Like other peoples in the Ottoman Empire, including the Turks themselves, they had developed aspirations for a national state of their own, which conflicted with the plans of Turkish reformers to make the empire more Turkish. It was only 20 years since such clashes had produced the horrifying Armenian massacres of 1894. Now, in 1915, the Turkish government, as the Russian army threatened its eastern frontier, ordered the deportation of Armenians from the war zone as potential sympathizers with Russia and the Western Allies. Supposedly, they were to be resettled in Syria and Palestine. In fact, in the atmosphere of military crisis, political hatred, bureaucratic contempt, and wartime scarcities, hundreds of thousands of Armenians perished in what most historians describe as a genocidal massacre. Virtually no Armenians remained within the territories that became the Turkish Republic a few years later. The surviving Armenians became another of the world's scattered peoples, with no state of their own except for a small Armenian republic, briefly independent after 1918, then part of the Soviet Union for 70 years, and finally independent again after 1991. At the same time that they were seeking to disrupt and dismember the Ottoman Empire, the British and French were using the war as an opportunity to take control of the German colonies in Africa. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, revealed to Colonel House, President Wilson's personal emissary, that the Allies did not intend that Germany should ever get its colonies back, though it also became clear that they did not intend to grant true independence to the people who lived there. In China, too, the third important area of imperialist competition, the war accelerated the tendencies of preceding years. The Japanese saw their own opportunity in the self-slaughter of the Europeans. Japan had been allied to Britain since 1902, and in August 1914, the Japanese declared war on Germany. They soon overran the German concessions in China and the German islands in the Pacific, the Marshalls and Carolines. In January 1915, Japan presented its 21 demands on China, a 1271 secret ultimatum for further concessions, most of which the Chinese were obliged to accept. Japan thereby proceeded to turn Manchuria and North China into an exclusive protectorate, Japan and China. As for the Germans, their war aims were even more expansionist and more menacing to existing boundaries within Europe itself. Early in September 1914, when a quick victory seemed within their grasp, Bethmann Hollweg, who remained chancellor until the summer of 1917, drew up a list of German war aims, which stayed unaltered until the end of hostilities. The plans called for an enlarged German empire dominating all Central Europe and annexations or satellites in both Western and Eastern Europe. In the east, Lithuania and other parts of the Baltic coast were to become German dependencies. Large sections of Poland were to be directly annexed, and the remainder was to be joined with Austrian Galicia to form a German-dominated Polish state. In the west, Belgium was to become a German dependency to provide more direct access to the Atlantic, and French Lorraine, with its rich iron ore, was to be added to the already German parts of 722 Alsace-Lorraine. Colonial adjustments, including the acquisition of most of Central Africa from coast to coast, were also projected. The political map of Europe and of colonial Africa would thus be transformed in Germany's favor: German expansionism. All these developments, especially the Allied negotiations, whether accomplished facts or secret agreements affecting Europe, the Middle East, Asia, or Africa, became very troublesome later at the peace conference. They continued some of the most unsettling tendencies of European politics before the war. It does not appear that the Allies, until 1272, driven by Woodrow Wilson, gave any thought to controlling post-war nationalism or what could be called international anarchy. As President of the United States, Wilson for a long time could see little to choose between the warring alliances, though his personal sympathies were with England and France. In 1916, he attempted to mediate, entering into confidential discussions with both sides. But both still hoped to win on their own terms, so negotiation was fruitless. Wilson judged that most Americans wished to remain uninvolved in European conflicts, and in November 1916 he was re-elected to a second term on the popular cry, "He kept us out of war." Wilson urged a true international neutrality of thought and feeling, or a settlement, as he said, that should be a peace without victory. A peace without victory. The war had thus reached a deadly global stalemate by the end of 1916, and it is hard to see how the First World War would have turned out had not two new sets of forces altered the military deadlock.